This is Professor Fordham, this is going to be the last lecture of this class. And of course, as you're going to see on the post today, that we were going to deal with in the very last class, we're going to do and have the final exam review posted there. So you will have the study guide for that, basically, for your future exam, and there'll be more information on that forthcoming. But for right now, the last lecture of this class is going to deal with the period in European history known as the Enlightenment. Now, we've already talked a little bit about Galileo. And if you'll remember, Galileo, who was dealt with a little bit on page 536 of your text. And speaking of which, by the way, the lesson for today is going to come from pages 535 through 543 of your text. But if you do not have your text with you, this video should suffice for that, because we're going to talk about the type of things that are going to be in this video. Yeah, I know, I wish I had thought about doing this earlier, but anyway, we're all sort of doing this as a work in progress, so bear with me here, folks. Now, having said all of that, we talked about Galileo a little bit earlier in this course. And Galileo got into some serious trouble with the Italian authorities. Why? Because he came up with this, he'd taken the ideas of earlier scientists, such as Copernicus, that the planets revolved around the sun as opposed to the idea of the earth revolving around the planets. So why was that controversial? Well, because some people interpreted biblical scripture as saying that the earth stood still and all this sort of thing. And so he said that he believed in the Bible, but he believed that certain things were allegory. And this got him a lot of trouble with the Italian authorities. They placed him under house arrest for his teachings. He basically died under house arrest a couple of years after he went blind, and it was not until 1992 that Pope John Paul II lifted the sentence on Galileo for heresy, which of course is speaking blasphemous things against the church. But the story of Galileo is one of many things that made this whole Enlightenment idea interesting. You see, we talked earlier about how Europe was in the Dark Ages for about 1,000 years. And then when you had Marco Polo writing about what he saw in China, that meant that more people would soon want to explore what was going on elsewhere. And what they saw elsewhere began a long chain of events that would lead to the return of knowledge in Europe. And of course, the church was primarily the main source of anything in Europe up to this time. But the church as more people began to be knowledgeable about things, the more they challenged the old authority of the church. And it's very important that I point this out, that contrary to popular belief, most of these people, the vast majority of the people who were involved with the Enlightenment and that we're going to talk about today, they were not themselves atheistic. They did believe in God. Their problem was with how man was running the church, you see. And it's very important that we make that distinction. So, with Europe beginning to have all of this commerce going on with China and with Africa and the Americas and so forth, it brought a lot of capitalism to Europe, in that Europe was starting to make money off of these goods from these foreign countries, and of course they would later begin to colonize the people in these countries, and of course this would lead to issues of enslavement. Now, in one of our last courses, we talked about Ulada Equiano, who was a black man who was captured from Africa and later eventually escaped to England, where he began to write against slavery. And so all of these things going on helped to add to the economy of Europe. and various other aspects led to the whole idea of the intellectual rebirth of Europe. We also spoke earlier of Leonardo da Vinci and his various inventions and so forth. And all of this began to take shape in a more organized form by the 1700s in Europe. Now, after Galileo, you began to have some other really interesting scientists who came up with some very unique ideas. Among them was Sir Francis Bacon. Sir Francis Bacon was born in 1561 and died in 1626. And he said that science basically was the result of several factors. He first talked about this thing called the hypotheses. Now, most of you who have taken science earlier in your courses know that a hypothesis means an educated guess. And along with the issue of the hypotheses, he added that you basically had to test them in carefully controlled experiments. Pretty much. You had a hypothesis and you tested it out by the experiment, and then you drew your conclusion from that. He added, though, that he believed that people should go ahead and do these type of experiments before believing anything off of face value. That whatever they were taught, that they should investigate that matter. And one of the people who was influenced by that was the great Sir Isaac Newton. Now, Sir Isaac Newton, many of you have heard of him. He was born in 1642 and died in 1727. And he basically wrote a book called the Principia Mathematica, which of course is Latin for mathematical principles. And it was he that came up with, of course, one of the most famous things of science, the idea of the law of gravity. And what is that law, ladies and gentlemen? What goes up must come down. And there came a point that England and France in particular realized that to go against these scientists who were proving all these different things would not be a good idea. Why? Well, they came to understand that the more the authorities spoke out against these scientists, that the more popular that would make these scientists, and this would bring discredit onto the leaders, because the people would soon kind of figure out, hey, wait a minute now, what's wrong with these people? If they are so bad, what is it about them? It would make, in other words, punishing these people would make the masses of people curious as to what these scientists said and would give them thus more popularity. In other words, it's the concept of forbidden fruit. With me so far? All right. So, with all that going on, you began to see these academies set up by these people called patrons of the arts. These were the individuals that would fund these scientists for what they did, and even many of the kings and queens themselves of post-medieval Europe would soon begin to sponsor these scientists. Okay? So that way, the scientists would be in harmony with the royals, and thus they could put out their doctrines and all that, and there would not be that much of a problem. Now, of course, this did run the risk of perhaps these powers that be silencing these scientists, but that would be another issue for another time. Now, another thing that would come about during this period was the rise of the philosopher. Now, what is the philosopher? There's no one set definition of that. I guess you could probably say that philosophers are people who try to make sense and study and analyze the human condition. Or they're people, you could say that they're people who deal with complicated subjects of humanity in simple ways. But in either case, we all know what it is when we see it. Now, y'all got to excuse these dogs back here and everything. These are the next door neighbor's dogs, and it's sort of a hazard of this, but hey, I'm going to keep on anyway. Now, having said all of that, The art of philosophy goes back thousands of years. As far back as ancient Egypt, you had philosophers like King Keti II and Tahotep. If you've taken the first part of this course, we've gone through discussions with people like this, who wrote down their analysis of the human condition in very interesting ways. 2,000 years later, in ancient Greece, you would have people like the great Socrates. And Socrates, of course, was fascinating because what he did was he had what was called the Socratic method. He was somewhat of a social outcast. He had fought in the Peloponnesian Wars, and he had grown distrustful of authority. So he was known for not being very well bathed and rather homely, in spite of the fact that he was married with children. And he would teach his students by getting up in front of them and throwing out an idea, and each of the students would respond, of course, in their own ways. And this would, of course, mean that everybody in the room would become educated with an idea, different ideas, and then he would have his conclusion about it. Well, of course, that was too much for the authorities of ancient Greece. And so they tried him on treason against the government, the ancient Greek government, the government of Athens. But he said that the thing for them to do was not in silencing men like him, but he said by punishing men like him in such a fashion, they brought the shame and dishonor on themselves, and people would look at them and see their ills. So the best thing that they could do was leave men like him alone. Well, they didn't take that advice, needless to say, so they forced him to commit suicide by drinking hemlock. And one of his pupils was Plato. And Plato wrote about Socrates' teachings in the Apologia, as well as he later would write the Republic, which was his idea of an ideal society. And Plato, in turn, taught the great Aristotle, who in turn would combine all this philosophy with various aspects of science that would be used much later on. And then in the ancient Roman era, you would have people like Cicero, who was one of the men who would eventually turn against Julius Caesar, but said a lot of amazing insights into human nature, things such as he who does not know what happened before he was born shall forever remain a child. Deep, huh? Well, with the fall of the Roman Empire, all of this kind of thing died out in Europe for over 1,000 years, while philosophy would continue in places like Saudi Arabia and in various forms in Asia, and in some cases Africa, when you had the Arabic writing on the west coast of Africa, as we discussed a little bit earlier. But anyway, with all that being said, philosophy began to make a comeback in ancient Rome, in post-medieval Europe, with the advent of people such as John Locke. Now, John Locke said a philosophy that was kind of basic by our modern day standards, but it was revolutionary during the days of post-medieval Europe. He was born in 1712 and died in 1804. And he came up with this idea called natural law. Natural law said something that was revolutionary for that time. All men are created equal, and that they were endowed by their Creator with inalienable rights. All men created equal, endowed by their Creator with inalienable rights? Wait a minute now, where did we hear that before? Most of you know this from the Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson, incidentally, was very well read in the philosophies of John Locke. But you see, nowhere in human history up to this point, with the exception, I guess you could say, of the Apostle Paul saying that in Christ there is no male, nor female, nor Jew, nor Greek in the New Testament. But the idea that all people were equal was revolutionary. And so John Locke was saying this in England in the 1700s, and of course this would eventually be picked up by Thomas Jefferson and used in the Declaration of Independence, which of course was how America broke from the rule of Britain and became independent. Funny how this works out, huh? So, along with John Locke, you had people such as Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who was born in 1712 and died in 1778. And up to this point, this was a common belief among people. Many people up until Jean-Jacques Rousseau believed that the masses of everyday people were ignorant and stupid. Just being blunt about it. And that they needed someone to rule over them. And that basically if you didn't have anybody to keep check over the people would run amok, go buck wild, and, drink themselves dry, drink the town dry, and have sexual relations with everything on two legs and so forth, that you just simply couldn't trust people even if they were grown to do right, that they had to be somebody in charge. Well, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the Frenchman, said, well, not necessarily. He actually believed that the vast majority of people were born good and were thus able to basically take care of themselves if necessary. And that, again, was a very revolutionary concept. Now, however, the king of these guys, though, perhaps the most interesting of them, was a fellow in France who was born in 1694 and died in 1778. His name was Francois-Marie Arouet, who was better known as Voltaire. And Voltaire was a French philosopher who really led a very interesting life, and it goes something like this. He was born to these wealthy aristocrats, high-born, which kind of goes back to something I've said, may have said a little bit earlier. The fact that most people who are revolutionary very seldom come from the poverty-stricken class. Why? Because oftentimes when people are born into poverty and injustice, often they get used to that. And it often takes somebody who was born to privilege and they see what's happening with the poor and with struggling people. They say, wait a minute, there's more to life than this. It shouldn't be this way. Those are the people who often commit themselves to revolutionary change. Well, because Francois was very well read and so forth, he began to do a lot of writing on his own, especially with poetry. But his father wanted more than that for him. His father wanted him to be a lawyer. Well, he didn't particularly care for the idea of doing law. He liked the, cavorting around with everyday common people. He liked to drink. He liked women, liked to party and all of that. And so he was in Holland for a period of time, getting work as a secretary. His father sent him up there to be a secretary, but he got involved in this extramarital affair. And so therefore he was sent back to France as a result. So while he was in France, he was writing very popular as a poet. He was doing what we would now call slam poetry. He was reciting it at different places and so forth. And he made the mistake of accusing a regent, a king in place between the Louis XIV and Louis XV. He accused this regent of committing incest. Oh my. Well, we have libel laws here in the United States and over here and over there. They didn't play that kind of stuff. So he was locked up for 11 months. And after he was freed from jail, he renamed himself Voltaire. Exactly where the name Voltaire comes, we're not sure. So he began to write satirical plays. What is satire? Satire is sort of like when you see things like, say, The Simpsons or Saturday Night Live and things like that, where they use humor to spoof real-life events in a humorous way to make you think. You know, sort of like what Dave Chappelle does, okay? And so Voltaire was getting pretty good at this. He would basically write things where he expressed, for one thing, he was a religious man, but he felt that the church was often very narrow-minded on some subjects and more interested in dogma rather than making humanity better, which he felt it should have done. He was also not fond of the idea of things like capital punishment, because, you know, they would often, in France in those days, when you broke various rules, chop your head off, things like that. He said, no. He didn't believe in putting people in jail to basically starve or whip them and all that. He had this revolutionary idea that the purpose of incarceration was to reform people, educate them, so they would come out and be better people and do better with mankind. Things like that. He was also against prejudice, against many people and things of that sort too. He was a very forward-minded fellow, and for his troubles he was exiled out of France for a time, went to England for a number of years, but he came back and was very popular, and they realized over a period of time that, you know, if we keep locking this guy up, his ideas are just going to get more popular, people are going to start opposing us. So after a while they left him alone, and his works are often read to this day, long after his death in 1778. Now, a couple other interesting developments came out of this period. There was a fellow by the name of Adam Smith who wrote a book called The Wealth of Nations around that time. And this book is considered the foundations of what we now refer to as capitalism. And that's one of the byproducts of the Industrial Revolution that was beginning to happen around this time. You began to see a situation where Europe was taking these raw materials and they were beginning the factory system where they would hire people to work in these factories to build things, to make them cheaply, whereas prior to that, people either made their own goods and they would often barter them with people. Ever heard of bartering? That's when you just basically trade goods. Like, say, you got a cow that makes good milk. Okay, you can sell that, you can trade that milk for some, say, ham that was butchered by a hog of a friend of yours. Well, this is where people began to use a lot of cash and currency and all of that on a more common level. And the modern financial system of capitalism soon came into being. And this, of course, would lead to our modern day economies. Came out as a result of this. So, there's another interesting aspect of this period too. While these people were coming up with these new ideas and all of that, they retained some old ideas. For one thing, not one of these people advocated the equality of women as of yet. It would not be until much later in the French Revolution that women began to speak up for themselves on a widespread basis, that is, and lead to the idea that women should take charge of their own lives, that they should vote and hold positions and so forth. That is outside of having a queendom, for lack of a better word. All right? Now, with all that being said, here was one really interesting after effect of all this stuff. Now, with the spread of the printing press, you began to have what was called salons. Salons were these gatherings where people would gather, usually from the middle and upper classes, and they would discuss the various books that they read. And it's basically what you would now call a book club. And this, of course, spread literacy among the masses of people over a period of time. And because you had the printing press now making books cheaply, they came a little underside to all of this. You see, there was for a time what was known as the philosophical books. Now, what's a philosophical book? I'm not talking necessarily of how of the books of Voltaire and Rousseau and all these other people like that. I mean, there was that too. But philosophical books was a euphemism. What's a euphemism? A euphemism is a substitute word or a politically correct word, if you will. Like, for example, if you say someone has passed away instead of saying they died, that's a euphemism, okay? Or saying that a person was expecting instead of saying they're pregnant, that's a euphemism, all right? So philosophical books was a euphemism for a type of literature that was particularly popular in France during this period. They would write these books that would ridicule people who were, like, say, kings and queens and so forth, or nobles or priests and all that, and they would have them in pornographic situations. Yeah. They would basically ridicule and lampoon these people. They would have, like, say, Marie Antoinette, who was the wife of King Louis XVI. They would have her prostituting and things like that. And they would sell these books with pseudonyms, fake names, if you will. And that the people, and see, years prior to this, people were afraid to speak ill of the kings and queens because they would be, well, with this enlightenment, people are beginning to question things more, and as they question things, they got a little bit bolder in their questioning, and that would lead to things like this. You see, these philosophical books. And they were just basically the foundation of the sort of dirty literature, pornographic type of literature that you would see on the underground level and such today. So that was one of the unintended consequences of the rise of the printing press. Just like one could say that a lot of what you see on the internet today was one of the unexpected consequences of the internet. Now, along with all of that, however, came a really interesting rise in a creation called the Encyclopedia. The encyclopedia, the first encyclopedia, was created in France around this particular time period. About, you see, and the purpose of the encyclopedia was the idea that all knowledge could perhaps be collected and come together in what was called this century of light, which was another word for, of course, the Enlightenment. And the first encyclopedia was edited by a fellow named Denis Diderot. And it was basically a compilation of facts and knowledge and things like that used to educate people. And the concept of the encyclopedia, now most of you who are millennials, who were born in the late 1900s and early 2000s, most of you are probably not likely to have used an encyclopedia. But before the days of the internet and before Google, you would go to the encyclopedia, and there would be about 26 or so books beginning that represented each letter of the alphabet and have all the different facts under each letter of the alphabet and so forth. And they were usually very expensive, but they were often people paid on it by installment plan, just like you would buy a car on a monthly basis. And by the time you were through paying for it, though, the information in it was outdated. For example, the encyclopedia that I grew up with at home, it came out in 1962, so it still has John F. Kennedy as the president, and it still has men not yet going to the moon, and Russia's still called the Soviet Union. But at least, however, this was one of the things that got people started on the issue of mass education. And these were some of the good things that came out of the Enlightenment. All right? Now, however, though, of course, just as, what comes up must come down, as we talked about earlier, there was another side to this Enlightenment. Along with Diderot's Encyclopedia, which was edited in 1751, you began to see science take a somewhat wrong turn around this period. Now, how could that be? Well, let me explain. There was a freshman by the name of Francois Bernier. That's Bernier. Francois Bernier. Francois Bernier. Okay? Francois Bernier came up with this. I wrote a book called The New Division of the Earth by the Different Groups of Races Who Inhabit It. It's written in 1684. And these people basically felt that they were different races in the world, i.e. the people of Europe, quote unquote white people, the people of Africa, quote unquote black people, the Asians, the Native Americans, and so on and so forth. And people didn't really get too deep into those classifications prior to this because, you see, again, unless you were an explorer or you lived in, say, the Middle East where Asia, Africa, and Europe connected, you rarely saw a person of another race anyway. They dealt with you by your nationality more than anything else. However, there was Carolus Linnaeus, a Swede, who took this up a notch. And he divided human beings in the following ways. He said there was